Now a great pleasure to welcome our next guest, Roger Hiorns. Welcome.
Hi.
Roger, the first question I wanted to ask you is, we started earlier this evening in one of the first conversations actually with Charles Jenks, sort of predicting the future and other things. And I was very surprised when I met you the first time. You told me that it was actually not an art book, but an architecture book by Charles Jenks, which kind of made you sort of start. So I was wondering if you could tell us maybe this story.
Okay. Well, it was a long while back. I won an award at school, and the award at school was a voucher for a book. And so the book that I bought was this really grand, really huge book on that was written by or compiled by Charles Jenks, which is an architecture book in the mid-80s. And so it went through all these different periods of architecture up to the present day, which was probably around then, the late 80s, early 90s. And so was a pretty detailed, there's lots of flies in here.
More, unfortunately.
Well, it was a pretty detailed book on the origins of postmodernism and also the late aspect of it. So anyway, I used this book in a piece of work which I was showing you at the time. I was also enamored by the fact that the Tate, the James Sterling building of the Claw Gallery was on the front. And then later I did a project outside the Claw Gallery at the Tate. And so there was a nice relationship which I was interested in at the time.
Hans, I'm noticing a kind of weird coincidence that almost every English story starts with school. Did you notice that too?
When you come to this thing,
it starts with school.
It's fascinating.
Is it a kind of particular quality of the English educational system?
Perhaps.
I would never mention school in any kind of interview. Certainly not in the first.
It wasn't
draft.
that long ago for me.
It was from the first interview on with
from the
Brian
first
Eno.
interview. Everything starts with school in England.
When you come to this thing, it's quite tricky. You're not quite sure what to expect, so you imagine things and you want to start from the beginning to some degree. Also, as well as that, the subtext, the idea of talking about London, sort of like so your relationship and sort of how you came to London, all this sort of thing. Well, for me, I'm not originally from London, so to some degree, the beginning of what I do is to some degree when I arrived in London. So when I was, Christ knows how old, 17. I arrived in London, and this is when I started working on things and sort of doing things. But I'm originally from Birmingham, which is another big city, but big in a completely different way, apparently.
And can you tell us more about London? London now? How?
London now? Well, I've got a sort of a strange sort of relationship to London at this point because I live above a pub on Fleet Street. And so the pub that I live on is a very old pub which was built by Christopher Wren to house his workers when they were building St Paul's and when they were building St Bride's Church, which is a church of journalists. It's when journalists have weddings or when they sort of die in combat, they have their funerals and their weddings at that church. So in a certain respect, it's the Fleet Street journalist sort of environment and the continuation of that, because the tradition of Fleet Street is disappearing when it comes to journalism pretty quickly. In fact, there's nothing left now. Reuters was the last, and that's just gone. So anyway, so I live above a pub, and I had like a pretty interested I was pretty interested in the City of London when I first arrived. So in a certain respect, it's a continuation of that fascination for me. I think the fascination originally was a slightly esoteric and slightly trying to get interested into the typical dark streets of the town, of the city, and now I don't believe in that at all. It's more of a sort of a walk through and an interesting place to live generally. And so anyway, so this pub, which is from 1670, is an interesting place to live. It's very old.
Bram, do you have questions or shall I? Maybe one thing actually, which we also wondered, was somehow the sort of issue of generation, because there has been obviously through the YBA sort of very visible generation of artists here in the 90s, and you're clearly part of the sort of new decade. It's very strange that this decade still doesn't really have a name, because I mean the 80s, the 90s, how do we call this decade? Olivier Zahn once called it the 00s, but that's a bit pejorative, but how could we name the decade? So I was somehow wondering if you feel there is a kind of a rupture with the 90s, if you feel part of a new generation, and if how you would somehow in London describe this new generation, if there are kind of links to other artists?
Well, the relationship is quite interesting. It's also quite problematic because obviously we came from a generation which was viewing, and when I was in London originally, we were viewing how things were panning out with the YBAs. You know, we went to shows, we saw what they were doing, we saw that they were becoming very famous, and you know, we were watching this thing happen. We were watching it play out to some degree. And then there's a relationship also with a number of galleries which were also showing work which was remarkably different from what the YBAs were achieving at the same time in London. So there was one gallery in particular, a gallery called Robert Prime, which I visited with a lot of friends that I had at the time, and so in a way you saw a different structure, you saw a different way of actually working. You saw
in what way different?
Well, in the way that they weren't celebrity based or something. It's an unfair thing to say, but there was a certain sort of aspirational aspect to the YBA generation, which wasn't really anything of interest to the way that I always saw things to be. I think that there was an interesting sort of development. I think it was interesting to bring that in, because obviously it was a remarkably relevant situation to be at the time. You had Tracy Emin sort of making work which was self-revelatory, and you also had a lot of journalism at the time. You had a lot of sort of books that were also self-revelatory at the same time. So it followed this sort of pattern which was happening generally within the media itself. So it made some sense that it sort of propagated itself through media too. So anyway, I was sort of looking into this. We were looking at these artists, and they're making interesting pieces of work, things, memorable things, iconic things, and they became a whole package, and they became something. And so in a way, the relationship is then very difficult to follow, because they needed to follow it up, and you know, you could give a toss about it or not, I don't know. And then, okay, so there's these other artists that were also showing in town, their first shows, some of them, people like Angela Bullock, Liam Gillick, Kai Althoff, sort of European artists, and so they were doing something which was remarkably different. They were sort of coming with with completely different sort of strategies and ideas about ways of to do things. So yeah, so you had a sort of real paradox of work kind of happening in a similar place at the same time. And so historically it was an interesting sort of relationship to watch. It was good that you had the alternative, because if you didn't have the alternative, then God knows what else would have happened. I think to some degree it would have shaped things slightly differently. So it was important at the time. Silence.
Many more questions to come.
Okay.
No, I mean, in some kind of way, but it would be probably take too much time, the sort of whole discussion, if there is, because, you know, in the 90s there was a clear rupture with the 80s, and that was somehow manifested to a sort of a very different relationship to objects, and, you know, maybe a sort of a doubt about objects or quasi-objects or things like that. And I was just wondering, you know, in terms of work, if you would sort of define, less in terms of media or strategies, but in terms of work, if you would see a clear difference in terms of that sort of...
What now?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a tricky one, because in a way there's all sorts of different strategies. For instance, you can come to having a strategy without having any strategy at all. You know, the word strategy exists, but you don't necessarily have to use it. So people are actually aware now that basically there's a non-strategy situation, that you can just basically just do things and just be and just do what you want. That can be tempered by strategies, or that can be tempered by the idea that you want to become a formalist to some degree, but your formalist attitudes towards things can be tempered by other things, sort of esoteric sort of natures of different works. It's a difficult question so much, because there's a lot of things that you can do, and to some degree there's not a lot you can't do. In fact, I don't think there's anything that you cannot do. So to some degree you can just basically negate history, and you can think about things in terms of just not separating art from aesthetics. You know, you can just carry on. You can just do things Does that make any sense? Or
Um,
probably not at this point.
I'm totally not an expert on sculpture, but
Have a go.
when I look at your work, I don't see somebody who's negating history, but I see somebody who's playing with Brancusi, both in substantial and kind of foam. I see somebody who's playing with the colors of Yves Klein and Kapoor. I see somebody who's playing with the aluminum of Frank Stella.
Okay.
And so
That's your opinion, and so it's kind
it's
of
not my opinion, it's my observation.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But I think in some respects, I think it's kind of interesting that you sort of develop and you can actually sort of you can develop your process through a sort of aesthetic by proxy. You can actually just sort of develop yourself into a certain aesthetic, and then it can grow from there, and then it becomes yours. So it's not an appropriation, but it's a sort of a transformative aspect. You can actually sort of transform yourself via another language, and through other languages that already exist, you can take that language somewhere else, and it becomes yours because it is yours at the end of the day. It's your thing. So to some degree, I think it's important if you're beginning your own language to find those building blocks within other languages. The other thing as well is that those languages then can be collided. That you don't have to be precious to any language at all, and so so the collision is where, and also as well as I'm interested in gaps between pieces of work. So, but I'll see if I get round to that in the exhibition.
There was something also that intrigued me. It was a kind of words. You combined intelligence and sacrifice.
Yeah.
Can you clarify that, or what does that formula mean?
The title of that actually might be disappointingly from an album by I forget his name now. It's a German. He went on his own, but he used to be in this band called Atari Teenage Riot. I don't know if anyone remembers. The name of his name, which always eludes me. So he was a member of that, and he brought out an album, a solo album, and I sort of interested in using it. I thought it was an interesting title. Intelligence and Sacrifice, I don't know what that alludes to with that piece at all. In a way that there was no illusion. There's always a disconnection between titles and the pieces. In a way that the titles always come after, and they're almost unhelpful. I'm not a fan of titling, so now everything I use is an untitled at this point. I'm going through an untitled bit. And in fact, I might even not use untitled anymore.
Thank you.
And what about writing? I had a question about writing. You have a practice also to write, and actually in the pavilion here we plan quite soon an event with you which will be more the form of a reading, of a lecture. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your practice of writing, and if it's a daily practice and how it sort of works.
Okay, so the writing is tricky. So the writing comes from... Okay, so the history of that was that I was doing a few lectures at the time. I was sort of having to do talks to the general public, and I was finding it a problem. I was finding the fact that the connection I was having with the public was there, and in a certain respects, the work that I make is also there's a subtext of detachment. I'm interested in the encouragement of a detached way or a nature that you can actually basically just isolate certain situations and circumstances and through actions. So the plays or the writing came from the idea which I was thinking about, which was I wanted to have lectures prepared, because I used to go into lectures and basically be like this, just talk and see what happened, and there was no structure, but I wanted to write a play almost. That my whole work became a lecture, it was preordained, it was prescripted, and that I would become an actor within the role of actually talking about my own work. And then the further bit was that I was quite interested in maybe sort of an actor then talking about my work at the same time, so I wouldn't actually have to be there at all. It also negated the idea that there would be questions afterwards, which were always sort of problematic in answering. And so the scripts that I started working on, I sort of worked on monologues, grew out of that. I didn't write my work into a play or a monologue. I took that a little bit further and just wrote monologues. And so, so I write monologues which are about the sort of action of detachment.
Many thanks to Roger
Do you
and
know
Hiorns.
each other?
Great.
Do you know each other?
Oh, do we know each other? No, we don't.
No, okay.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you.